Good morning. I'm Josh Weiner, reporting for SNN News. I'm here interviewing Mr. Pressel and Miriam Groner about the Holocaust. Mr. Pressel is also the author of the book They Are Still Alive about the Holocaust. Good morning, Mr. Pressel.
Hi, Josh. This is my mother, Mrs. Groner.
Hello. Is it a boy or a girl?
He's a young high school boy.
Oh, you interview me.
And me.
So tell me about the Holocaust, Mr. Pressel.
Okay, our family was in Belgium for many years. Our family was basically, at least my grandparents on my mother's side were Orthodox Jews, and they lived a traditional middle or upper middle class life. And
Very nice life.
yeah, then in the late 1930s and 1940, I lived with my parents. I was a child. I was like 6, 7, 8, 9 years old during the war. And they had heard about what was going on with Germany wanting to take over the world, and persecution of Jews and others. And so my parents knew that eventually the Germans would invade Belgium. So they had a suitcase ready because they were determined to survive, and the way they were going to do that was to escape to France. So on May 10th, 1940, the Germans invaded Belgium. So they picked up the suitcase, grabbed me, and we went across the Belgium-France border, and then we made our way to the southern city of Marseille.
Oh, yeah.
And we went there basically by hitchhiking, getting rides on trucks, a lot of walking. There were a lot of other refugees, many of whom got sick and died on the way. We made it to Marseille, and we lived.
Tell them what Marseille is, the border of France and Italy.
No. Marseille is the second biggest city in France. It's a seaport on the Mediterranean. And we found a very inexpensive place to live. And basically what I'm going to tell you is our story during the 5 years of World War II. This was not a concentration camp story. Luckily, miraculously, we had many narrow escapes from being arrested and deported to concentration camps, but we never did. So our story is a story of 5 years on the edge of disaster, running away, escaping the Nazis.
Nobody knew that we were Jews.
That's a very good point. My parents, nobody could know because we would be denounced. People seeking favors with the Germans would say, oh, we know Jews, and then they might be rewarded with something. My parents were very smart. They never told me that I was Jewish until the war was over. Because as a young kid going to school, I could say anything. Other kids would find out.
Children didn't talk.
And they could tell their parents. So we lived in Marseille for 2 years. My father was not able to work. His work, he was a newspaper man, he was a writer, he was a stenographer, but to find a job or go to work, he couldn't. Why? Because the Germans occupied that area of France. And if he was seen on the street as an able-bodied man by the Gestapo or any Germans, he would have been immediately taken sent to a forced labor camp and eventually to a concentration camp. So my mother did all of the work through most of the war. And what kind of work did you do, Ma? My mother, by the way, is 102 years old, and it's through her efforts as a hero and my father, but mostly through her, that we survived. Very difficult living there, and at the time I was approximately 5 years old. By the end of the war, I was close to 9 years old, and as the older I got, the more I remembered. Anyway, my parents decided that this was in 1942 now, after living in Marseille for a while, that we would move to the central French city of Lyon, where there was a better chance of getting work for both my mother and my father. So we did move to Lyon, big city on 2 rivers, lots of bridges, and I went to school. And then in 1943 and 1944, when we were living there, first we lived in a small rooming house. We left that rooming house after a couple of months and we moved to an apartment kind of downtown. We had lived there for a short while when there was a knock on the door, and one of the neighbors who was living in that boarding house told us that the landlady, who was figured out that we were Jewish, and she was a collaborator with the Germans. And so she denounced us, and that we had to leave immediately because we were going to be arrested within the hour by the Gestapo. We did, and throughout the whole war, my parents had a suitcase ready by the door in case of an emergency or bombings. We grabbed it, and we had clothes, and we left. And we went to a farm that they knew about 150 miles away, and we stayed there for quite a while until it was safe again to go back. So we lived in that apartment. My father was able to give a few lessons in stenography and languages, but primarily my mother did some dressmaking. She had done dressmaking for a particular woman while we were living in this rooming house, slightly outside of Lyon. And this was an important thing later. Okay, so she made dresses, and she got paid by money, and oftentimes with food, with vegetables, once in a while eggs. You know, we lived, my whole youth, I gotta tell you, my whole youth, throughout the war, I had hardly any clothes, had no friends, had no privacy, terrible food, and I mean, it was bad. So she earned money and food from farmers or whoever she was able to do work for. One of the payments came in the form of a live rabbit. And I kept that rabbit in the apartment, and I fed it vegetables. It lived in a little box, remember? The rabbit. And finally, what happened?
We had to eat.
We had no food.
Keep the rabbit. We went to the butcher, and he killed him. And we gave him the skin, which
By
was
train.
the payment.
By train. Everything was by train. We had, in fact, throughout their whole life, they never had a car. So we traveled by train, and European trains are very, very good.
What?
He asked about trains, how we traveled. So then it became into early 1944. By 1944, the Allied troops, namely Americans and British, were starting to bomb Germany and France, where we were.
And
Why
we
were they
happy when we heard the bombs.
That's right.